complete information overload. So hopefully you guys are excited about learning what's new in HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript, and not just thinking about the party later on. Although I know it's going to be a great party, lots of food, music, and some great drinks. I'm going to actually turn my slides on. All right. My name is John Hervatten, and I'm a lead program manager on the Internet Explorer team. My team builds what we refer to as the Windows 8 web platform. It's the component that provides the HTML, the CSS, and the DOM support that powers both Internet Explorer and Metro-style apps built in HTML. I've worked on the Internet Explorer team for 7 years now, on everything from setup and group policy in IE7 to the F12 developer tools in IE8 to HTML5 and DOM features in IE9. And I've been lucky enough to see and be a part of several big advances in the web and the web platform. And I can say without a doubt that this conference, is the most exciting time that I've witnessed. When I think about IE9, IE9 introduced hardware acceleration to the web. And with hardware acceleration, the web gained the raw power of the PC. Windows 8 and IE10 add new capabilities that let you harness that power in new and interesting ways. And of course, give you a completely new medium, really a new opportunity for building on the web platform and leveraging that platform in Metro-style apps built in HTML. Of course, for me and for my team, and I think really for all of us who've been building this product of building in Windows 8, the time we're really looking forward to, the event that we really want to go to, is when you guys launch your apps and your sites. I can't wait to see what happens when you merge your talent, your creativity, and your enthusiasm with this platform. And that's why this conference is really the start of a journey. It's the trailhead on the way to building amazing sites and Metro-style apps on the web platform. And this session in particular is about giving you a broad view of what's available. What are the tools and what are the capabilities and the features available in the platform that you can take advantage of in your apps and your sites. My goal for this session is for you to leave here excited and inspired, not just to go have fun at the party tonight, but excited and inspired to explore the Windows web platform and to start building your sites and your apps on it. I've arranged the content around 5 of what I think of as characteristics of great sites and apps. And for each one of these sections, I'm going to show you a bunch of demos to give you an idea of what's possible, and then I'm going to go into the technologies that I used to build those demos. I'm going to cover a lot of technology, a very broad set of technologies. So I won't be able to go into any one feature or feature area in too much depth. Instead, along the way, I'm going to point you to a lot of other great sessions that are happening later this week or have already been recorded that I really hope you guys get to, or at least are able to watch online afterwards when you get home. This slide is the one you saw yesterday in Stephen's keynote. You saw it in Alesh's session. You probably saw it in some other sessions this morning. And it's great because it's the mall map, right? It's the directory that lets you say you are here. Now for this session, we're living squarely, not surprisingly given the title, in the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript world. Okay? And with Metro-style apps, that world now spans both the browser and this new app model. Now, the important takeaway from this is that all the features that I show you today work identically in Internet Explorer and Metro-style apps using HTML. Yesterday, you saw a lot of great things about the Windows runtime and about contracts, and those are all things that are unique and special about Metro-style apps. I'm not going to talk about those today. My session is about the core web platform, the things that are common to both of these runtimes. So with that, actually, I'll do a quick question here to get a feel for who's here. I'd like you to raise your hand if you would say the language or the technologies you primarily develop in are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Your primary one. OK. And raise your hand if your primary is XAML and C#. OK. Got it. So I have a lot of people who are excited to hear about HTML. I imagine a lot of you have played around with HTML and CSS and JavaScript, have some ideas about it, but kind of coming into this maybe as your professional main development model for the first time. So great. With that, let's get started right into the demos. Now, I've built all my slides in HTML5. So as you can see, I'm actually running these in the browser. This isn't PowerPoint. So all my demos are just built right into my slides. And the first one that I'll show you are the slide transitions. And of course, you've seen the first one. It's just a simple fade. I can transition the opacity of one slide from 1 to 0 and get a simple effect like this. Nothing too exciting there. Well, if I use that same CSS3 transition, but apply it to the positioning of the slide, I can create an effect something like that. Now, what if I want to make it a little bit more complicated, a little bit more maybe gratuitous, I don't know. I'll add a transform, and I can get a kind of cool effect like that. Now, for those of you that have spent a bunch of time in the web platform, you may look at these and say, I'm pretty sure I could build that with JavaScript animation. I'm pretty sure I could figure out some way of doing that. And for several of the technologies and the demos that I'll show you, there's some workaround today. There is some way you could coerce the platform into doing what you want it to do. What the CSS3 support in IE10 and Windows 8 provide is a simple way to do this. Instead of writing tons of JavaScript to make these animations possible, or dealing with photo editors and all these image assets that take forever to tweak and then deploy on your site, this just happens in your markup. You're going to spend less time building your projects and using these cool effects in your projects, and more time simply being creative. And for those of you who are new to the web platform, wow, you came at a great time. You should go find some of the people who've been coding on this for a long time and ask them just how difficult it's been to achieve some of these effects in the past. And of course, some of these simply aren't possible today. So I put together this next transition. I call it Rails, using a 3D transform and the motion. Kind of fun. You'll see that once more. I promise I only use it once more, but I think it's cool. Now we'll talk a little bit about the features that I use to build those. And the first one is CSS3 2D transforms. 2D transforms let you apply a transform function like skew, rotate, scale to any element on your page. In the past, you may have applied these to image assets and then just deployed that static image to your site. The problem with that, of course, is that you have to go back. If you want to make a tweak, you have to go upload these images. They're not dynamic. They don't change with your content, and you can only use them on images. The slide you're looking at here is an interactive slide. And it's one of what we call a group of hands-on CSS3 demos. And they let me tweak. On the upper right here are the properties of this CSS3 feature. And then as I move them, you can see the effect live on the top left, and then the code and the markup that I would use to achieve this effect on the bottom left. So I'm going to translate on the X direction and the Y, can rotate, scale it down a little bit. And to apply this to my site, all I need is to add this tiny little bit of CSS. Now, I mentioned that these will apply to any HTML element. Now, my entire slide here is just a bunch of HTML. So I'm going to apply these transforms to the entire slide. So I can scale down all this content. I can skew it. I can rotate it. And of course, this is just web content, so it's still completely interactive. All right. Now, the next feature here is 3D transforms. You may guess what this means. It's the same as the last one, except there are some 3D functions and 3D effects that you can use. So here, I'll show you a rotate on the y-axis, little perspective. I can change the origin if I'd like to. And of course, once again, I can apply these entirely to my site. So I'm just going through a rotate, a perspective, a translate, and now one more translate. And again, the content is completely interactive. I can select the text while it's transformed, really do anything with it. Now, the point at which these transforms get really cool and are really useful is when you animate them, when you use CSS3 animations or transitions. Hopefully you saw Jensen's talk yesterday. You heard all about fast and fluid. You heard how great it is to have animations and what word he'll use to describe content and apps that don't use animation. So this is a very important piece of technology in the Jensen world. Now, animations give you a very simple declarative way of applying an animation. There are 3 steps to it. The first step is to define the characteristics of the animation. You say, do I want a start delay? How many seconds should it wait before the animation starts? You define the duration. How long should the animation take? And then you define a timing function. The next step is to create keyframes. These keyframes can be as simple as a start and finish of one property. For example, opacity from 1 to 0, done. Or they can be as complex as 10, 20 different style properties, 10, 20 different CSS properties that change any number of times between the beginning of the animation and the end of the animation. And then there are a series of events that let you run script either at the beginning or at the end of these animations. Now, the great part about them, of course, is that you don't have to run script to move through all of these keyframes. You declaratively define the keyframes, and the browser takes over. There's the last time, I promise. Transitions are a little bit different. So you start the same way. You define the characteristics of the transition with the delay, the duration, and the timing function. Except instead of having to build these complex keyframes, you simply choose the property or properties that you want to transition for that element. So animations gives you the very complex, detailed, fine-grained control you may need in certain scenarios. Transitions, on the other hand, gives you very simple fire and forget. All you have to do is change that particular property on an element, and the browser just takes over. So here's the code that I'm going to use in a second here. The first line is how I've been applying the transforms to my slides, the demo that I showed you a couple slides ago. And now I'm doing this, running this through script, so I can use keystrokes and everything on my demo. But the equivalent of just putting it in your CSS file does the same thing. So all I do is I set the transform function, and that does these. Okay? Now the next 3 lines are how I apply the transition. And you see all I'm doing is saying the property that I want to transition is the transform property. The duration is 2.5 seconds, and I don't want it to delay at all. Now I'm going to hit a keyboard shortcut here and turn on the transitions, and all of a sudden, running that same line of code at the top turns into this. Much more fast and fluid, right? Jensen is feeling a little bit better about this. And of course, the same thing works with the 3D effects. So I didn't have to decide exactly where everything should be, what is the path I need. I just turn on a transition, and the browser does all the hard work for me. Gradients is something you see on the web all over the place. You've probably built them, but you probably had to do it either in an image asset or using maybe an SVG background image in IE9. With CSS3 gradients, you just put this in your markup. Now this hands-on demo lets me build a couple gradients, play around with the colors I want to use a little bit. Something like this, maybe. And this line down here, again, is simply the only piece of code that you need to add to your CSS to achieve this same effect. Now I've built a few into my slides. Here's a pretty harsh, maybe blue gradient on the background. The next one I'm going to show you, I want to warn you, is an example of how, while there are technologies that can make your site beautiful, they do not guarantee it. Okay? It is almost never a good idea to use a purple and green gradient. So while the features let you do it, I suggest you avoid that. Here's a little bit more gentle silver to white radial gradient, bottom to top. I'm just going to go back to my background, original background images. Now, text shadow. Text shadow is similar to gradients, something that maybe you've deployed on your sites before, but you've had to do it in image assets. You can't apply it dynamically to your site. It's just kind of a pain. Well, with CSS3 text shadow, you simply, you can see the text shadow property down here. It's a comma separated list of values for the horizontal offset, the vertical offset, blur it just a little bit, and get a nice looking shadow. One of the things that I think is pretty cool about this is that besides just a shadow, you can create another cool effect. Let me get these back to 0. Oops, a little bit too far. There we go. Pick a better color. And what you get is this kind of a cool glow, right? So you can do these sorts of effects on your text and build these good visual effects with very little effort. So the series of CSS3 that I just saw you makes it really easy to build those beautiful sites with just a few lines of CSS. As I was putting together these demos and putting together these slides, I spent more time just playing around and trying to come up with that Rails one or what's the ugliest gradient I could possibly come up with than writing the code. And that's the value of these. You get to spend more time being creative, thinking of what your app should do, how you want to differentiate your app, than spending a lot of time coding and debugging. And of course, hardware acceleration on Windows makes sure that all these great visual effects are not only beautiful, but they're also fast. So this is the first call out to another session that I'm going to make. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., there's a great session on building beautiful and interactive apps with HTML5 and CSS3. It's by my colleague Ted Johnson, who's the person who wrote all of the hands-on CSS3 demos. Highly recommend that you get up for 9 a.m. tomorrow. It's going to be a great session. He'll go into a lot of these features and then more in greater depth about using them in your apps. Let's move to another visual aspect of sites, the layout. When I say layout, I mean how you present or arrange content on the screen. You want to do it in a way that attracts users, that draws them in, and makes that content easy to consume. We'll start with an example. Now, this site could be a news site. It could be a blog entry. If I make the HTML5 logo a shoe and put in an add to cart button, it could be a shopping site. Somewhat generic. But what's interesting about this site is that it uses several techniques to make the layout engaging and attract users. So the first thing you'll notice is that all the text in the middle is multi-column. So it uses two columns. The text is hyphenated and justified. It also has a float in the middle, or what you might call a figure. You see these all the time in print media, but you've never seen them on the web because they were really hard to do. Well, there's a CSS3 feature called position floats that makes this really simple. You'll notice that the overall structure of the app, now I'm not claiming this is the same red lines, that's all Metro-y, but it's a very structured layout. There are no scroll bars. My content is multiple pages, but it's paginated within the site. Now, if you could build something like this with CSS2.1, which you probably can, the thing it likely wouldn't do is adapt that well to changing content, or if you wanted to move things around. So I'm going to move this HTML5 logo and just drag it with my mouse, and I want you to watch what happens to the text around it. Right? All the text flows automatically. Those are the people who've been coding in CSS for a long time. Now, this is done through a single property. I'll show you the code in a few minutes that makes this possible. Now, the other part of this I want you to see is watch the page break. You'll see that right now, the last sentence is the scope of this specification. By the way, this is text from the HTML5 spec appropriately. As I move this, the page break changes, right? And it adapts. The content in this adapts automatically. I'm not running script to put the right text in this div versus another div. The browser flows this through automatically using a new feature called CSS3 regions, again, which I'll show you the code for in a minute. So how do we get here, right? How do we get to this place? We're going to press my DeLorean button and go back in time to in the middle of development. So as I was building this demo, I got to this point. And all I had done was said, I want my site to have a title and a logo and a menu and an image and text, et cetera. And then I defined the styles. Said, oh, I want this font. I want these colors. Great. Now the hard part, at least for me, has always been laying it out. So if I draw some lines like this, I said, this is the grid. This is the structure that I want to have my site in. Trying to coax CSS2.1 to put my site there is pretty difficult. It doesn't map, at least for me, mentally, right? Like you have all these weird floats. And the problem is that CSS2.1 was designed for long, flowing content, like a web page. And sometimes that's great. But in this case, I want a little more structured layout. I want something that feels more app-like. So here's the code that I'm going to use on my site. Now, grid is a feature that you saw a couple times yesterday. And there's a reason for that. It's awesome. It's incredibly simple to use. If you look at the top left, what you'll see is that I have a display property that the value is -ms-grid. All that does is say that particular element, in this case the body, is the container for my whole grid. The next two lines set up the columns that I want, how many columns I want, and the sizes, and then the rows. Every other bit of CSS on here is simply taking other elements and placing them different places in the grid. Now, where that content is in my markup, in my HTML, makes absolutely no difference. This will just position it in the correct place in the grid. So with this CSS, I apply that, and immediately my site turns into much closer to what I'm looking for. Now, what happens if I change my mind? Right? I decide I want to be a little bit more metro-y. I want to put my menu off to the left. All I have to do is make a quick update to my CSS. So you'll see in the selector, the style rule outlined in red, all I've done is change the grid row and the column that I want to place it in. And I've said that I only want this to span one column instead of two like it was before. With that simple change, my content automatically turns into this. Okay. The value this provides, and the reason it's just so easy to use, is that what you have in your mind on your design, or what you've drawn out with the red lines like this or on paper, now can map to the markup that you're writing. Right? The problem with CSS 2.1 is that it didn't really mentally map to what you would visualize. And that's why people would go to tables. Right? No one really wants to use tables for layout. But when you see a grid like this, you're like, well, I can kind of figure out what table rows and columns I would want to apply to that. And so it's very tempting to use tables for that. Well, with grid, you get the benefit of separating your content from your presentation and using CSS, but you still get that great mental mapping from what you see and what you visualize your site to look like to the markup that you would write. So now that we've got the overall structure built, I want to flow the content through it. So I'm going to enable multi-columns to get to this point, turn on the position floats, and then turn on regions, which is what lets me do the pagination. Now let's look a little bit more at these. So this is the hands-on for CSS3 grid layout. Not going to spend too much time on this one. You saw it a couple times yesterday. I'll point you to yet another session to go to at the end of this section. But the one thing I'm going to go to is there are a few sample grids here to use in this demo. And this is a basic 3-column site. Again, you draw a grid like this. This is what I want my site to look like. And the markup looks just like it. It maps directly to it. And that's the value to take away for grid. This next feature is one that you haven't really heard about and that I didn't use in my demo. But it fits within the same category of grid. It helps you structure your content in a more understandable and flexible way. You'll hear this called Flexbox. You may have heard about this before. The primary takeaway and the main scenario here that I want you to think about for Flexbox is when you want to mix regions of your page that you want a very precise size for, or maybe you want it to vary only slightly, with another section of your page that you think that you really want to be able to expand and take up all the available white space. So this example in this demo is 2 fixed width columns, and then a third one that will take all the available white space. Now, if I were going to use this for my article, you can see here's the property that I would apply to each of these. And those values simply map to the width and how the white space should work. On the container, they're a longer series. So this is an example of where I don't have time really to go into too much depth on this one. But for my example, I would want the middle column to adjust and fill all the white space, and the third column to be fixed. Again, you can do that and have that control simply with your declarative markup. And then, of course, there's the CSS3 for content flow, multi-columns and hyphenation. Multi-columns are used in every form of media except the web. It's simply the physiology of the eye that makes it easier to read lines that are of a certain length. right? Your eye can find the beginning of the next line easier if the line isn't that long. They're good to use. If you have lots of text, just use them. Position floats is the feature that lets you put that figure in the middle of the text, and then CSS3 regions does the pagination. Oh, actually, I have this in VS instead of a slide. So here's a little bit of the CSS for that. The multi-column, very simple, column count, I want 2. Column gap defines the number of pixels, the spread I want in between the 2 columns. And then the hyphens is what turns on hyphenation. The next rule here is the position float. All I need to do is set my float to positioned. You'll see the vendor prefix on these because these are proposed standards. So we put the MS on there so you don't automatically expect that they're going to work perfectly in all browsers. So to make this work and apply in another browser that has an early implementation, you'd put -webkit or -mos or -o. It's not a perfect solution, but it's the best one we've got right now. And it lets you use these today. And then an absolute position. And everything else is pretty standard. And then the regions. So here's the rule for the regions. MS flow into. Now I apply this style rule to an iframe. That iframe points to an HTML file that has all my article text in it. When I apply this property to it, that iframe is immediately hidden from my page. And the browser takes the content from that iframe and applies it to whatever elements I put MS flow from with the same keyword. Okay? Now, I've done this with 2 elements, article text 1 and article text 2. So the browser takes the content from the iframe and puts it in this other div. And if there's more content that can fit in that div, it automatically flows it in the other div, regardless of where it is on the page, actually regardless of what other type of element it is. It flows the content. And that's how it can adapt to the changing content. So if my article is longer or shorter, the content just flows around it. All right, let's go back to slides here. OK. Building engaging site and app layouts is about presenting your content in a way that draws in your users and makes the content easy to consume. It lets you use declarative code that's easy to write, easy to understand, and can adapt to changing content. There's a lot to be said about layout and about these great new technologies that are available within the Windows 8 web platform. And there's a session tomorrow, 1 p.m., given by Christian Stockwell on designing Metro-style apps using CSS3. And he'll explain these in much more detail. He understands them much better than I do. I'm somewhat new to these as well. And so it's a great talk to attend tomorrow afternoon. Now we're going to move away from the visual aspects of sites for a little bit, and we're going to talk about the core functionality of sites. And we're going to start with offline. There are 2 categories of offline sites. The first category are those that simply keep you from making a mistake. So you've written up your big email, or you've written up a blog post comment, like the perfect blog post comment, and you don't realize that your network has just gone out, and you hit send or post, and you just lost that content forever. Sites deal with this with connectivity events, with basic local storage, things that have been around since IE8. The category of sites that I'm interested in today are those that function, that work fully when they're offline. So here's the first example. This is a children's book. It uses a series of images. There's a little audio in the background, but I'm not going to play it here, as well as just a couple videos. Right? All very big and touchy. And this app works completely when offline, because it uses HTML5 app cache to cache all the resources, all the images, the video, the audio locally. So that your kid can use this book in the car or anywhere else where you're on the go. Here's another example. This one is a collection of fan favorite recipes from the Food Network. I can browse the collection, check out different recipes, or I can search. I like cheese. Here's some chicken enchiladas. Now, all of this functionality, the browsing through the site, including the searching, works offline. Again, this is I like using the air quotes for just a website, because websites can do so much. But it does this, again, by using HTML5 app cache to cache resources, but also using IndexedDB. IndexedDB is a full local client database that you can use from your website or from your Metro-style app. This last example is something maybe you've played. Someone probably had this when you were in college, the little magnetic poetry game. I'll actually show you more about the magnets in a later demo, but for right now, I'm going to do something with this fridge that we've all probably done, and that's pin a photo to it. So I have Windows Explorer open to my pictures library. I have a nice build logo image here, and I'm just going to drag this over to my website and pop it in. Now that image is in my website, pinned to my fridge. This happened entirely on the client. There was no server-side communication. There was no server-side processing. I didn't have to go to a file upload control and browse my hard drive. And this happens through HTML5 drag and drop and the file API. All right, I'll take another. Oh, I didn't hide my taskbar. Let's do this. All right. HTML5 app cache is a manifest-based caching mechanism that lets you create offline scenarios. It also improves performance and reduces your expenses. Instead of constantly downloading these resources from over the network, which costs your user time and you money, you can use the local cache much more efficiently. It improves the availability over the HTTP cache. It's a much more straightforward mechanism than using all the HTTP headers and the temporary internet files, or the TIFF, as we like to call it. And anytime you want all those resources to update, you simply change your manifest. So kind of the technique is, I'll just put a version number and then tick the version number up whenever you want people to get this completely. So here's what this looks like. On the left-hand side, you'll see my markup. And in the HTML element, you have a manifest attribute that references my manifest file. I call it test.appcache. And on the right-hand side, you have what would be in that manifest file. It's very simple. The cache section lists all the resources that you want to cache. The network lists all the resources that you say must come from the network. And then the fallback section lets you choose which resource to load depending on whether or not the user is online or offline. So if you want the browser to try and get an image if it's online, but if not, then I want to substitute something else from locally, you can do that with the fallback section. Now, app cache is something that one of two examples in this talk that while it's available or functions within Metro-style apps, it really doesn't make sense. All of your resources for your Metro-style app will already be local because you've deployed them in your package, okay, with your app. Now, if you've gotten to the point of looking at apps that you can host web content within your app, if that web content uses app cache, it'll work just fine. It'll work perfectly. But for the most part, you'll think about this as something for a website. IndexedDB. IndexedDB gives you the ability to use a full database on the client. You store key value pairs in object stores, and then you index into those key value pairs using properties on the JavaScript objects that you stored in them. Okay, now this is really a whole other topic for another session. But the general thing to come away with is that you have a full database to use locally. It is, however, not a relational or a SQL database. The benefit of that is that there's no dependency on a browser's implementation. So if you do any database work, you know that the SQL syntax across different versions of SQL, different implementations of it, are slightly different. Well, we didn't think that was the right thing to introduce to the web. Because when we put content in the browser and the web platform, it's meant to work interoperably using the same markup across all the different browsers. So IndexedDB gives you a slightly more low-level API that you can use. And not only will it work across Metro-style apps and Internet Explorer, but also in any other browser that implements IndexedDB, which there are a few, and the number is growing. And then finally, File API. File API lets you read data from files chosen by the user. I chose a file by dragging it into the browser. A user could also choose a file by picking it in a file upload control. It introduces several new objects, the blob, binary large object, a file and file reader, and several methods for accessing that data. Now I want to show you, just a little bit of code. This is the code, a couple snippets from that magnetic poetry demo. That demo, by the way, is out on the IE Test Drive site, ietestdrive.com if you want to check it out. At the top, what I'm doing is creating a new instance of a file reader object. And the main thing I'm doing in that first block is setting up my handler for once the file is fully loaded into memory. And then I'm calling read as data URL, which is an async call that reads the file into memory as a data URL. Pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory from the name. The second half of the slide is the code for my event handler, for the load end event. And all I have to do is take the result property where it stores all the data from the file and set it to the source property of my image. That's it. Right? Now, if I wanted to do something more complex, I wanted to edit the image, I wanted to manipulate the data, I could. I have it now in this result. But for this example, all I wanted to do was display it as an image on my page. So these are 3 technologies that are really great for having, using and accessing local data, building offline scenarios, caching resources with app cache, using a local database with IndexedDB, and then reading and manipulating file data with the File API. There's a session tomorrow afternoon, later in the day, on building offline access in Metro-style apps. Highly recommend you go to this. As you can tell, I don't have time to go into all of the IndexedDB details. There's a lot of great stuff to learn there, and a lot of great ways to use these in your apps. All right. Now we're going to talk about building interactive sites and apps. And of course, it's Windows 8. What better way to start than with touch? So I am going to switch over to my little Samsung. Have you guys been playing around with your tablets so far? You like them? Pretty cool, right? Little rough around the edges here and there, but pretty fun to use. So this is the latest IE Test Drive site. We put this live yesterday. You can see it's all big and touchy. And the first one I'll show you here is Lasso Birds. So this is a game that was built using the new pointer events. So the Windows 8 web platform has support for pointer events, which lets you code for touch, pen, and mouse through a single set of events. I'll just play this for a second using the novice. I'm not very good at this. Here we go. I'll try the experienced. I'm not experienced. OK. This is the type of interactive, touch-first app that you can build natively on the web platform. Right? This is no plugins. This is all using the native HTML5 platform. Back here. And of course, I can use that. I wanted to show it off with touch because that's the cool thing. It also works with multi-touch. It works with a pen. And it works with a mouse. I want to show this one quickly just because I think it's kind of neat. This is just a little magnetic force field. It shows off a little bit of the graphics power here, but also the ability to do multi-touch. Try and do this without making it go too crazy. Switch to the repulsion. That one's kind of fun. All right. Go back. The other demo I want to show you here is an app. It's a very, very simple touch sample. All it is 3 images in a row. Right? So it's 3 images. It actually uses Flexbox to have them lay out horizontally, and that's it. What's interesting about this app, though, is that it uses a couple new features, a couple new CSS features, to make the touch experience great. And it's things that you're definitely going to want to use in your apps and your sites. And the first one is panning and zooming regions. So you'll notice that while these images are right next to each other, if I zoom in to one, I'm not going to zoom in the next image. You can actually see it clipped just a little bit on the side there. I'm only zooming this one. And that's because the app uses CSS to mark up a particular zooming region. You can imagine this is really useful in a map scenario, for example. If you have a map control embedded in your page or in your app, you want the user to be able to manipulate that map, either zoom it or pan it, independently of the rest of the page. And with a couple lines of CSS, you can achieve that effect. The second thing this app does is define snap points. So when I zoom, I never want it to stop right here, right? I always want it to land nicely on an image. But I also don't want to have to write a whole ton of JavaScript to figure out where exactly is it and move it to the right place. Well, we built that into the platform. So with a couple lines of CSS, using snap points, you can make sure that even if I lift my finger right here, it will always bounce back to the closest image. I'll switch back and show you that CSS. So this is the CSS for the snap points, MS Scroll snap type and MS Scroll snap points. There are two types mandatory, and I believe it's proximity. And the snap point, the snap interval is just where you want it to snap to. And then for the zooming and panning regions, this is the only line that you need. MS Content zooming, I want it to zoom. And that workspace, this particular rule applies to every individual image that I have on my site. So if you just want a random div that you want the user to be able to manipulate on its own, you apply this property to it, and you get that great effect. OK, back to slides. There are a lot of great tools and technologies available for building touch apps. All the things on this list here are available for Metro-style apps. The items in the green box are the ones that are common to Metro-style apps and the browser. The first couple are incredibly important, first couple overall, the templates and the controls. You've hopefully heard a lot about, these give you so much for free. They let you get the best practices of touch. They really give you a jump start so you can spend the time differentiating in your app. The next ones are the few that I'll have a couple more slides on. But there's an entire session on using everything in this list. Unfortunately, it's right now. And you guys have chosen to be here, which I think is a great choice. But I recommend that when you get back to your hotel, these should all be online within 24 hours of the presentations. Get back to your hotel tomorrow. When you get home, go watch this session. They'll use this sample. They'll go through a lot of the code, and not just the CSS sample, but how it uses these events as well. Talked about the panning and zooming views. Not going to go into this too much. The real value of this feature is that it lets the browser do all the hard work. It's kind of a theme that you've seen so far and that you'll see again. We're taking all the hard work from the site or the app's JavaScript and putting it in the browser's C++. Right, that's really what we're doing as we move the web platform forward. Pointer events. So pointer events are how you write uniquely to all these new cool forms of input. So you can use these pointer events to handle touch input, pen input, mouse input. Of course, if you have sites or content that is only written for mouse events, those will still work, even with the touch or a pen. But what the pointer events provide are the additional touch-specific or pen-specific properties. For example, the geometry, if your pen is slanted, or the pressure, all the capabilities that you can get based on the device that you're using, you now get those properties on these events. So it follows the familiar pattern of mouse events. So if you've used those before, these will feel pretty natural. But they give you all the new information that you need to fully take advantage of these new forms of input. Gesture events are a little more complicated. They give you access to the Windows 8 touch language, but they take a little bit more to kind of dig into. And I'll leave a lot of this for the other touch session. But the thing to take away is that there are a couple classes of gesture events. The first one are very simple one-shot static events. So you get a tap or a hold, start, cancel, and end for that one hold gesture. Or you have dynamic ones, where you'll get events around it starting, inertia, for an entire manipulation, for an entire movement that you can build onto. All right, taking a step back, these are the three that we've gone over. MS Pointer events let you code for touch, mouse, and gesture in a unified way. The gesture events let you easily access that Windows 8 touch language. And of course, the scrolling and zooming views let you harness the power of Windows to build highly responsive experiences without writing a ton of code on your own. All right, we're back to the fridge. Now we're going to show a little bit more about interactivity, but we're not going to talk about touch. So prior to HTML5, the only things you could drag on a web page were images, anchor tags, and selected text. And as a web developer, you can only prevent that from happening by writing JavaScript to cancel a bunch of events. Well, with HTML5, you can make any element, any content in your page draggable in the markup by setting the draggable attribute. So I've done that with all these. I believe these are all spans, if I remember correctly. And I can build this drag and drop experience, this drag and drop interaction that is familiar to some of you. You've seen this on the web before, but those sites had to either use a plugin or they had to use a large library, something like a jQuery, which is great in a lot of ways, but again, less JavaScript, more power just using the browser, letting the browser do all the hard work for you. In that same theme, we'll look at HTML5 forms. So for all those of you who've been doing web development, or even if you've been doing it in XAML, you've probably built and written some validation code. Right? You have a form, you have to do the validation, make sure that the entries are correct, that they filled out all the required fields. And you have this repetitive JavaScript that you've probably used several times. HTML5 forms let the browser take care of that for you. So in this example, I've created a form that uses markup to define which fields are required. Now, if I were to try to submit an empty form, I get an error. But that error is native to the browser. The browser is doing all of that, the styling, the error message for me. All I had to do was create the form elements and position it on the page. Similarly, this site has marked up some of these text fields using the new HTML5 input types, for example, email. So the browser now knows what a real email is, so it can give you an error message when you try and submit something that it knows should be an email, but there's an error in it. Again, the browser's taking a lot of this hard work for you. Now, it doesn't force you to use these native error experiences. There's an entire set of a validation of DOM events, and there are styles that you can use to customize this experience. So maybe you don't want the red outline, or you don't want it to show the browser's UI. You really want to use your own so it feels native to your app or your site. You can do that as well and still get that validation, that checking done by the browser. So HTML5 drag drop, quick summary here. You can make any element draggable. This is also what lets you drag files from the desktop into the browser. And then HTML5 forms. You can finally get rid of that repetitive JavaScript and replace it with some simple HTML, some additional markup. And you can either use that built-in validation UX, or you can customize it and build your own on top of the validation events. Last part of the interaction slide, HTML5 history. Ajax-style sites are those that update content regularly without the user having to refresh the page or navigate to a new page. This has been around for a while. You've probably heard the term Ajax a while ago. Now, the problem that Ajax-style sites creates is that the back and forward button rarely then do what the user expects them to, or you can't grab the URL and send it to a friend, and they'll actually hope that they'll get to the right place. Now, IE8 introduced Ajax navigation, which let the website edit the hash. The hash is just all the text after the hash or pound symbol in the URL. And that solved the problem in certain ways, but it left a little bit to be desired. And that's because there are some places where the full path is important. For example, if you're collecting data on your server and you look at the referrer property in your HTTP traffic, that doesn't include the hash. It's automatically stripped off. That's just part of how the HTTP headers work. So you weren't getting that data if you wanted to use Ajax navigation. If there were crawlers that were crawling through your site, search crawlers, for example, they wouldn't see a link that only differed by the hash as a new page. So they wouldn't crawl and wouldn't index that site. Well, enter HTML5 history. HTML5 history lets you edit the full path of the URL. so that you can get the behavior around back and forward navigation and sharing links that users expect while still getting the data or the other behavior that you as the site developer really care about. So I've built, I'm using HTML5 history all along on my site. So you can see that maybe it's a little bit small if I get rid of the highlight here. You can see that I have a query parameter at the end that tells me what slide I'm on. Each one of these URLs will go directly to the slide I want. And I've never had to do a full refresh or navigate to a new page throughout the presentation, and yet I have a link directly to the right place. And I would get the back and forward behavior that I'm looking for from the browser. So that's easy to build touch-first interactivity, starting with pointer and gesture events to let you code for touch, scrolling and zooming views to build highly responsive pinch and zoom and flick experiences, and then HTML5, forms, drag and drop, and history that let you use less JavaScript while providing the same great interactive experience. One last point to make on HTML5 history. That's the second example of the two of technologies that simply won't make sense in an app. An app doesn't have a back button or a forward button or an address bar or even a URL. So history is another technology that you really want to think about and that you'll use on your sites rather than in your apps. OK. And this is the last section that I'm going to go through. And it's about transferring data between the client and the server. The demo occasionally takes a little bit to load. Are we good? Yes. I never logged on. So I'll let that sit while I talk. Many new scenarios on the web today, things that we use every day, are about real-time updates. Right? It's about getting your news feed, getting data from the service, getting things immediately. Or maybe it's interaction. Maybe you're chatting with someone. All these are about constantly sending data back and forth. It's about the real-time web. The problem is that HTTP wasn't designed for the real-time web. HTTP is a request and a response model. So every time you want new data, you have to send a new request and they have to send a new response. And there's a huge amount of overhead for what maybe is a tiny little bit of data. And what this led to is a bunch of crazy hacks, right? A bunch of these create a hidden iframe with linking to an HTML file that never really finishes loading just so you can keep sending data down. Well, this is just incredibly inefficient, and it's kept a bunch of really cool scenarios from being possible on the web. And WebSockets is the solution. So WebSockets lets a site create, let's say site and a server, create a connection through a handshake that they can reuse, that will stay there. Either side can immediately send data using that connection to the other one. This makes that communication so much more efficient when compared to normal HTTP request and response, that entirely new scenarios are possible. And this is one that I'm going to show you, if I can remember the login and password. I think that's a good sign. So this is a demo. This is an app called Citrix Receiver, built by Citrix. Now, of course, Citrix is interested in providing hosted in-data center solutions for their customers, letting people access whether it's applications or data or really anything that you could host in the cloud so that you can access it from any device that you're using. And this works entirely through WebSockets. So for example, here, maybe I'll try this Doc Finder one. This is all running, again, native to the platform. There's no plugin. There's no ActiveX control. There's nothing else running that lets you run these. I'm on another Windows desktop. It isn't in this one. On another Windows desktop remotely. And it's sending the data down to the client using WebSockets. Here's a completely hosted version of Word. Again, this is all just the web. Okay? This is another place to put just in air quotes. Right? It's pretty cool stuff. And this is just one example of these scenarios that are enabled through WebSockets. You can think about other ones, whether it's just an easier way to build a chat client in a browser, or if it's building a complete remote desktop solution, or maybe it's a virtual whiteboard. where two people can interact on a diagram, on a chart, in real time. All right. WebSockets. You may have heard about WebSockets if you were at Mix earlier this spring. We talked a little bit about it. There were some kind of jokes on the web a little bit at the end of last year because the standard for it, the specification, kept changing. And at one point, it changed to a place that had a big, giant security hole. So it wasn't really in a good place about last December. But the industry and Microsoft have really worked together to move this standard along. And we're in a place now where it's very nearly done. It's really at a place where the set of changes, the set of differences, or things that may change are likely unlikely to affect you. So we're happy to put this in IE 10, in Windows 8. It's available for sites. It's available for Metro-style apps. And of course, it's standards-based, interoperable. If you want your HTML5 clients, your users to be able to use different HTML5-capable browsers. There's another whole session on this. I actually think it's a chalk talk on building real-time web apps with HTML5 WebSockets. I think the code for that is 373 here. Don't remember exactly when it is, but you can get much more info on using WebSockets in your apps. So while the slide says there's more, that's all I have for this particular session. But there's a ton of new technologies that I didn't really get a chance to talk about today. A few notable ones are up on the screen. HTML5 Sandbox. Sandbox lets you restrict the capabilities of an iframe. So let's say you're hosting third-party content in an iframe, and you don't want that iframe to run script. You don't want it to be able to open a new window. You don't want it to be able to load a plugin. You can do that declaratively in your markup using HTML5 Sandbox. Parsing. The HTML5 parsing algorithm, well, HTML5 is the first version of HTML to define the entire parsing algorithm, even in error cases. So we've all left off tags, had some misnested elements, and just had a couple bugs here and there in your markup. Well, with HTML5 parsing, even when you have errors, it will still work interoperably across browsers. Web Workers is a technology that lets you create JavaScript services that run in the background. So you can offload a bunch of your heavy-duty JavaScript calculation to run off the UI thread to keep your app responsive. Spell checking, kind of self-explanatory. XHR or XML HTTP request is really the backbone of the web communications. It now has progress events. You can send binary data through XHR. You can upload multiple files at once. And there are a few new hit testing APIs that we built. Do you guys like those expression blend demos? The HTML editing, the visuals in there? I just loved those. I thought those were great. We built a few new hit testing APIs so that their visual editing would work, but they'll be great for your apps and your sites. Now, the links down here are really good ones to remember, and they're to the IE9 and IE10 developer guide. We started these in IE9. We put them out with each new platform preview that we release. And the idea is to give you a single page where you can go to see all the new features. So if you're thinking, hey, is this feature new in IE9? Is it new in IE10? Is it in the latest platform preview? Just go here. There's an entire list. It's not the full reference, API reference, SDK, but it will just tell you what features are available. And we'll update it with each platform preview. If you find features that are there that we forgot, tell me, because I want to make sure it's accurate. And then, of course, questions after build. You've probably seen that link before. Really, the best way, of course, since you guys are here, you're lucky enough to be here in person, is to go to the related sessions. This is a collection of all the ones I mentioned today. So I see people taking pictures. That's good. Grab these session numbers. Go to these sessions this week. Watch the videos later. The one I didn't mention during this session was the fourth one down, 50 performance tricks. That's a talk given by Jason Weber. He's given that presentation at a few other conferences, and I think he may be up to 70 or 80 different performance tricks. I think one of the tricks is actually getting through all the tricks in one session. He's the performance guru, so somehow he can do it. But that's a great session to go to and learn about making performant apps. And then there are a few pre-recorded. So these are already available online. You can go back to your hotel or watch them when you get home. For those of you who are new to HTML, the first one is a good one to start. It doesn't tell you everything about HTML5, but it gives you kind of the core building blocks, some fundamental technologies or patterns that you want to learn and become familiar with as you build more and more in HTML. The second one on web workers, and the third one, a great deep dive into graphics. I started this session by talking about IE9 and providing hardware acceleration. And I didn't talk much about what else IE9 added. There was a ton of new technology first introduced within IE9. And this session was entirely about things that are new in IE10. If you pay attention to the web platform space, you may already know about all the things on this slide. If you don't, then this is another great list of things to go learn about. These are the tools that you're going to use in building your sites and your apps. And really, this is the alphabet soup, the standards listing that developers like you turned into sites on beautyoftheweb.com, which is our IE9 showcase of beautiful websites. Everything on this slide was new 6 months ago. Okay? In March of this year, we launched IE9. Everything there was new. Today, it is exactly 6 months to the day from launching IE9. And the Windows 8 web platform looks like this. Everything in white there is new that we've added since IE9. This is the opportunity that's available for you within the web platform. The new capability is the additional capabilities that you harness that hardware-accelerated platform. And of course, with Metro-style apps, you have a completely new opportunity, a new way of building on this platform and leveraging its power and the momentum behind it and all the great functionality that's there. So with that, really want to encourage you to go explore the capabilities of the web platform and lead this next wave of exciting software and amazing sites with Windows Metro-style apps. Thank you. I think my reminder I always need to put up is please fill out the session feedback. The last thing I do want to say is, since the last session, and I don't want everyone to get to the party on time, I don't have time for questions right now, but I will be around tomorrow morning after Ted's session at 9. I will be down in the expo by the web platform booth, and I will be there for several hours, probably from 10 until like 1 or 2. So if you have questions, please come by, ask me. I'm happy to answer whatever you're curious about. Thanks.